So the quiz question was, would you support spew, right? Didn't I ask that? Yes? So that's kind of interesting. I don't know what possessed me to do that. But, when we're thinking of Hegel, I do think of our contemporary sociological point of view, that we have a socially constructed reality. So, in a sense, we create fictions, the fictions become facts, and then we have to live with those facts, so they become objectified, right? So you have a constant kind of dialectical process that creates new culture. And Hegel thought of this as progress. And it's progress towards what? Towards a particular goal. And the goal for Hegel was freedom, so more and more freedom. Did I talk about that last time? No? But so it's interesting in a contemporary analysis, relatively contemporary, Francis Fukuyama gives us here's a Wikipedia article on the book. This book came out after the Soviet Union collapsed, and it looked like the form of government of the United States and the form of economy associated with the United States, free market capitalism, was essentially going to then just triumph and spread itself all over the world, that all the countries sooner or later we're going to have to kind of mimic this. There are books like Thomas Friedman referred to things like the Golden Arches theory, that no two countries that had McDonald's would ever fight against one another. Just kind of interesting things of that sort. So the idea of the end of history isn't, of course, the end of time or the end of things happening, but instead the end of political history in the sense that a final ideal organization, as far as human beings could be perfectly organized, that a free market capitalistic representative democracy would be essentially the end of history. That's the end of political change, because all the world will essentially become one big country like that. Obviously, that's all not happened, and Fukuyama has done all kinds of wonderful writings ever since, and have eaten crow, I guess, over this issue. He could of course argue that this wasn't necessarily what he really meant either, but but still, it's kind of interesting. So, in a sense, this is the Hegelian perspective that the goal of history, progress, was centered on developing a political arrangement and an economic arrangement whereby individuals had the most possible freedom that they could have. That was the goal of history as far as Hegel was concerned. And notice this is also what's going to lead Marx to think that revising the kind of prediction that Hegel sort of made would lead to instead a communism, right? That would be the logical sequence, right, and so on. In fact, by the way, contemporaries still argue that Marx's argument is the better one, and that once we have a worldwide capitalist society, that what we would eventually see would be a revolution against the capitalist class, because we get that separation between the 1% who have most of the wealth and everyone else, and it's going to create a melancholy among all of the people that have so little, that essentially they're going to have to do something. It'll have to be violent. They won't be able to just gradually vote people into office that will let us instead take all the wealth from the wealthy and spread it around. It's not going to happen. They won't let it happen, et cetera. Right? So the Marxists certainly feel that the end cataclysmic result against the capitalists would have to be a violent overthrow. It's very much as Fidel Castro did in Cuba, et cetera, and all that sort of thing. I don't know if you've been reading about Obama's visit to Cuba and his time with Raul Castro. Today, Fidel Castro published a critique of Obama's visit with the idea, that Obama might have expressed, I guess, positively that the United States could help Cuba out. Like, what? There's so many wonderful things about Cuba, says Fidel. Look at, it's not really a worker's paradise for sure, but nonetheless, he's certainly advertising that they did a lot of things right compared to, the things that we have. They have more doctors than they can handle. We don't have enough. I suppose you can imagine all kinds of interesting. So the thesis that Hegel gives us regarding the storyline, the narrative of history, is essentially something that we've embraced. Really, a lot of folks clearly thought of the United States as representing that Hegelian model, etc. This is some more stuff about his life. He's a high school teacher in Nuremberg. That's also when he printed his Science of Logic. It's interesting, in the United States we think of Hegel's major work as the Phenomenology of Spirit. In Europe they think of the logic, the big logic, the grand logic, as the main work that they read on Hegel. And there are differences, so that gives you a different perspective on what Hegel's philosophy ends up entailing in some respects. He ended up teaching philosophy in Heidelberg for about, 2 years, but then he was invited to Berlin, which was at the time the most prestigious position. In fact, he's the head director of the university there. Dies in 1831. Some initially thought it was the plague that got him, but an interesting argument by Terry Pinkard in his biography, Hegel, argues that Hegel essentially died because of a stomach ulcer, probably because of so much coffee while writing all of his books. He kept himself alert, writing with coffee. In fact, a specific brand name, I can't remember the brand name, but a specific German brand name of coffee. One Hegel quote was, "There's an awful lot of coffee in that book," It's kind of interesting.
That's not good for your stomach, huh?
That's interesting too. My grandfather had an ulcer and was operated on to remove part of it and never really fully recovered his health from that. He lived much longer, but I always remember him being in pain because he had a surgical hernia as a result of that never closed. So he ended up having all kinds of agony for the rest of his life because of that. My dad, as a young man, had half of his stomach removed also for an ulcer. Now we know that ulcers are not caused by stress and acidic, too much acid in the stomach. It's caused by a particular bacteria. You've probably heard about how it was discovered by an Australian medical doctor who published his results, and everyone said, nah, but eventually it became proof. So basically a good dose of antibiotics targeted for that particular bacteria solves the problem. But I remember being in college, not knowing the future of how ulcers were going to go, and thinking, gosh, am I worrying too much? Worrying might cause ulcers, so it stressed me out that I would be worrying too much about it.
Right, causes more worry.
Right, exactly. So we talked about how in the phenomenology, the section that we have in our text, the master slave. By the way, it was really interesting. I was reading in this biography on John Stuart Mill that his book on liberty is essentially the argument that we see in that particular section of the phenomenology. And one of the reasons why not having slaves is essentially a really important part of increasing liberty in the world, because you end up becoming dependent on those, because you get all your work done by those slaves, so you're tied to the slaves and so on. So neither of us are free by that relationship. So it's pretty interesting that clearly Mill was, of course, influenced by Hegel, and used that argument then as the central argument in his book on liberty, which is also the book, by the way, that gives us the expression liberal, right? Not libertarian, but liberal. So the idea of liberal, not as, say, a blue state democratic, but liberal in the sense of trying to create as much freedom as possible in the government for as many people as possible. Should be tied to the principle of utility, the principle of utilitarianism. So the greatest good for the greatest number. So that's John Stuart Mill, who's a follower of Jeremy Bentham, but you can see that that's interesting how they're all interconnected. So consciousness first begins with sense certainty, perception. These are theoretical constructs that Hegel has trying to describe sort of the stage that the baby has. What's it going through right now? Sense certainty. It's finding stuff and so on. But eventually it'll be able to realize it's perceiving things. Do we sense that we're perceiving? But you're perceiving, right? By the time we become around 2, we now reach the stage where we have appearance in the supersensible world. Supersensible is the abstract ability that we have to deny the way things are. In other words, at that point we reach what's called the terrible twos, and you can say no, right? Mom says, come here, and you go, no, right? You can conceive of not doing what your mom wants you to do, right? And then that leads eventually to the self-consciousness stage. This is also in a lot of, I think, psychology texts, they refer to the mirror effect, right? So now I can look at the mirror and I see myself and I know it's me that I'm seeing in the mirror, right? So I'm self-aware, right? And I think you could test different kinds of animals and tell whether they're self-conscious or not. So parakeets, when they see the mirror image of themselves, they think that's a buddy bird, another bird. Parrots, on the other hand, they know that's them, right? So there's a distinction depending on the mental ability of the parrot, right? Same thing with, I think, chimpanzees. They know it's them. So they're like checking themselves out and stuff. And roughly, when does that happen with toddlers? Roughly around 2, do we begin? That's like a significant point where if you're looking at the mirror and you know it's you, then you're obviously reaching the stage of self-consciousness, right? You're aware of yourself, right? So at that point, then we have 2 sides to us, so to speak. The for itself, that's the self as it is apparently to me, and the in itself, that's the subject who's having that experience, right? That point in the rest of the book, he continues to go on and describe how these stages reflect themselves in the history of philosophy. So we can literally go through the history of philosophy and say, aha, these individual stages become historical stages of society. So it's sort of like what Plato says, that the state is man writ large, right? So as an individual evolves, so does the state. And of course, with this theory, by the way, we see that we can argue that as a state enables an individual to evolve to higher and higher stages, primarily through education, right? Through literacy, through awareness of other people, and so on, that your stages of personal evolution can go much further than, say, in a society that's not literate, not aware of other nations and so on, thinks that why is Siam so little? You know, when, you know, that's from The King and I don't know if you remember that, you know. Yul Brynner, he's all upset. Why is Siam so little? Remember, he's the king of Siam. The world is so, you know, so if you're from a primitive society that doesn't have much of a cultural opportunity for you to grow and mature, you're not going to be able to go through very many of those stages. But if, on the other hand, you're in a society that offers everything, which, you know, I mean, by definition, we have that kind of society, you can mature to the point of basically insolvency and self-destruction. Well, that's terrible, but you get the idea. You know, we have David Foster Wallace, perfect example of someone that's matured to the point, understands as much as it seems like anyone can understand the nature of the human, and he kills himself because he's so disappointed in the results. Obviously, that's not right. Are you familiar with David Foster Wallace? Yeah. David Foster Wallace scares the crap out of me because I'm supposed to be helping you guys become like him. What a terrible result. You know, there's got to be something. No, wait, you know, I don't want you to go there. You need something besides what happens to him. So David Foster Wallace. There's a movie made of him last summer. His most famous novel is Infinite Jest, which is like yay thick, and it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. It's like making fun of you the whole time, and it never stops. You know? So it's an infinite jest. It really is. Interesting. It's also sort of autobiographical, which, by the way, is one of the helps to me because he was, at least to some extent, using drugs, and that affected him. And my hope is that it's not the philosophy education, the literacy, being aware of our contemporary state of existence, but that there was something else going on in his life that created the depression which he had, and he was unable to cope with. So I'm hoping that that's not what did it. So this is actually him in an interview with.
Attention began coming at a time when I could do all the things working for. A lot of people had the time to get working. So the stuff about me or the interesting rumors that developed about the book and all that stuff.
Did you get a couple of degrees? You don't have to wear a hat like that.
I didn't like that very much just because I wanted people to read the book. I'm sorry, I'm essentially stuttering. So other than that, I mean, I don't think I'm more hungry for respect than the average.
Let me talk about this book, a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again, which is one of the pieces in it. I want to talk about David Lynch, who after I read your piece in Esquire.
Was it Esquire?
No, Premier. I interviewed David Lynch. You never got to interview David.
Well, I said from the outset, there's a reason they let me on his side of all the other journalists. I was the only one who said he did not, in fact, want to interview David Lynch.
Why did you want to go observe David Lynch?
I found, you mean why did I not want to interview him? Or
No, well, why was David Lynch interesting to you as the subject of a magazine piece?
For me, the number of film directors who get national distribution in this country who are truly interesting is obviously very, very small. And Lynch was one of them for me. I've been interested in witches films for a long time, and actually in grad school, I think there's a thing about this in yesterday. Blue Velvet came at a time for me when I really needed to see it, and it helped me a lot in my own work. And
So that's him. He made a movie about his life, or at least part of it. It's called The End of the Tour. It's about the end of the book tour that he had selling Infinite Jest. And that last, the end of the tour, he was
When I think of
interviewed
this trip,
by
I see
Rolling
David and me
Stone.
in the front seat of his car. He wants something better than he has. I want precisely what he has already.
David. Wallace, welcome to Minneapolis.
Hi, I'm David Larson. How are you?
Hi. Okay, David and David.
We only just met. He's writing a piece on the tour. What's this story about in your mind?
Just what it's like to be
So
most talked about
that's
right
an
in the
actor
country. That's
portraying.
You're like a nervous guy, huh?
No, I'm okay. How are you?
I'm terrified.
I gotta ask, what is with the bandana?
I know that it's a security blanket for me whenever I'm kind of afraid my head is going to explode. If we ate like this all the time, what would be wrong with that?
It's like good seductive commercial entertainment, like Die Hard.
Not first Die Hard?
First Die Hard.
Great
Yes,
film.
no, it's really
The
cool.
best.
Hey, isn't it reassuring to have a lot of people read you?
I think if the book is about anything,
Yeah.
it's about the question of why. Why am I doing it? And what's so American about what I'm doing?
If they're responding to your work and your work is really personal, then reading you is another way of meeting you, isn't that right?
That's so good.
Thank you.
I think that if there's a sort of sadness for people under 45, it has something to do with pleasure and achievement and entertainment. Like a sort of emptiness at the heart of what they thought was going on. I got a real serious fear of being a certain way. I treasure my regular guyness.
You don't crack open a 1,000-page book because you heard the author is a regular guy. You do it because he's brilliant.
What is with you?
What is with you?
So, David Foster Wallace, a person I would hold up as, wow, there's the goal of a good education today is to become as brilliant and interesting as he is. But obviously, at the same time, there's a tremendous danger there because of the suicidal nature of his predicament. So that's scary. But nonetheless, so we get the idea that societies have a chance for individuals to progress as far as the society enables it. And there are individuals, like J.K. Rowling, advertising spew, what is she doing? She's teaching young kids already to hate the idea of prejudice, or that individuals are being treated incorrectly because of a social class, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this dynamic in our culture that enables progress to take place. Each individual is trained to behave within the scope that society permits, but we are also pushing that envelope. We don't want to just remain that way. So some of us are going to push that envelope and take us further into the future by changing things. And as we create those new boxes, fill them with concrete, we've got new ideas that then become real for everyone else, et cetera, right? So progress, evolution, actually. And this is really the first place where we see that. And notice that his book is published in 1807. Notice that there's already then an impact of this way of thinking throughout Western Europe, England especially. Darwin's grandfather was familiar with the concept of evolution this way, for example. So multiple strands of different approaches to how things might be interpreted and so on. But by the time we get to 1859, we've got Charles Darwin publishing The Origin of the Species. We've got John Stuart Mill publishing On Liberty, which is, when you get right down to it, it's how do we take evolution and apply that to happiness, right? How do we increase happiness, liberty, freedom for more individuals, right? How do we do that legally, socially, Mill was absolutely convinced, yes, we have to change society in order to change the individual, but you have to change the individual in order to change the society, right? So there's that dialectical process between the social self and the individual self, right? So it's a dialectical process. With Hegel, notice he literally decides that this traces the history of philosophy, so we see Stoicism as one example, skepticism results from that, but from that then leads us to the unhappy consciousness. David Foster Wallace, there he is, wow. So what happens is David Foster Wallace got stuck. He got stuck. He didn't move on to the next stage that Hegel tells us, which is reason and then spirit. Right? Some interesting quotes from Hegel. The rational is the real, and the real is the rational. That comes from Theory of Right, Theory of Justice. Gosh, I can't think of the title of the book. That's actually I've shown you this video, right? This is how you study Hegel. Did I show you this?
Oh, nice. I haven't seen it.
This is how you study Hegel. There is some action. I curl my slipper.
You already did it, I think.
I already did it. I only do it once. Have you turned the page?
Oh no, there it is, yeah.
Oh, there.
I saw something down there for a second.
This was the first video I ever made and posted on YouTube.
How many hits does it have now?
Like 13,000?
Yep.
13,218. Plus I have, look at all these comments. I have pages of comments, some of them in other languages. That's pretty interesting. I even have one guy that did a response to
Video?
a video response to it, Denken on Nietzsche, which
We are in a time limit.
however, what's interesting to me here is
I just skipped to a different
Yeah, you have to go back to yours
I have
if you
to
want
go
to see
back?
the ones that are associated.
yeah. Shoot, I don't see it. Oh, here it is. So this is a German talk show, kind of like Jay Leno or whatever.
Ich warte auf den ersten Anrufer,
I'm waiting for the first caller.
denn wir haben Hegelwochen. Liebe
This is
Freunde,
Hegel Week.
lasst mich nicht
Dear
im Stich.
friends, don't leave me stuck.
Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel, der irre Typ aus Stuttgart, großer Denker, Hegelwochen.
So this is
Der
Hegel.
große Weltchecker, deswegen haben wir unseren Weltchecker-Checkpot
George
mit
Friedrich.
3 Millionen Euro.
If you get the answer, it's 3 million
mich
euro.
an,
Call me.
in
Call me.
welchem
In which
Film
book?
von in welchem Buch
Which
von
book?
Hegel ist der Satz,
Is
das
the phrase.
Wahre ist das Ganze, Freunde.
The truth is the whole.
Das
In
Wahre.
which book
Und
is
dann
the
den
truth?
ersten Hallo, wer ist da?
Ja, hallo?
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 Ja,
Must be
hallo, hier
right.
ist der Holger aus Wuppertal. Das ist ein Zitat aus Minima Moralia.
That's a phrase from Minimum Moralia. No,
Scheibenpflaster. Holger, schade.
That's
Das ist
Tenny
von
Adorno.
Titelglatze Adorno.
wrong offer.
Kann ich nicht gelten lassen. Danke, dass du angerufen hast.
No money lost. Thanks for calling.
Markus? Marco? Sick.
He's gone.
Leitung ist frei.
The
3
line is
Millionen sind
free.
im Welt.
3
Checkpot.
million euros in the
Jackpot.
jackpot.
Hegel, das Ganze ist das Wahre. Nee, das Wahre ist das Ganze.
The truth is the whole.
Wer weiß, in welchem Buch das steht?
In which book is that written?
Hallo?
Ja, hallo, hier ist der Marcel aus Jüchen. Also
Marcel.
das ist aus Faust, erster Teil.
Faust, first part. No.
Fast. Fast, aber wir suchen hier ja was von Willy Hegel, nicht von Goethe. Schade, danke fürs
It's a shame.
Mitmachen.
Thanks for
3
participating.
Millionen bleiben im Jackpot.
3
Und wir
million
haben für
stay
Sie
in
zu
it.
Hause nächste Woche die Frage:
Next week.
Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. Welcher Tiername versteckt sich darin?
Animal
Nächste
name
Woche im
is in the
Weltchecker
Tractatus
Jackpot.
Logico
Danke fürs
Philosophica.
Mitmachen und hier sind die Schmuggel.
I got a hint. It's the duck rabbit. Remember the duck rabbit? It looks like a duck, but when you think, hey,
Oh,
it
yeah,
looks
yeah.
like a rabbit.
Yeah.
That's the,
Meine Damen und Herren, der nächste Gast, auf den bin ich sehr...
okay, so as you can see, the Germans make fun of Hegel. That's the whole point of that.
Sehr gespannt. Günter Klaus hat einmal über Sie gesagt, danke.
Fart doesn't mean fart as we say it in English. It means travel. So you can
Like
say-
ausfart.
Yes. Okay. So the rational is the real, the real is the rational. Haha. They even make fun of that in German TV. It's kind of cool, right? Hegel follows Kant, seeking the conditions of rationality. What are they? Why? So Kant says our minds are structured, and that's why we perceive phenomena. Hegel's, okay, so how does that happen? Let's go see. It comes from culture. Kant had limited such conditions to formal structures of the mind. Hegel extended them to include aspects of historically and socially determined forms of embodied existence, i.e. culture. Remember, this is my interpretation of it, although it's based on a lot of, other authors. So culture becomes what is rational. So then you're rational within a particular form of life or culture, which is different than another one. So rationalities become different, and of course come into conflict, which, by the way, of course, creates this dialectical process: one culture against another, one of them superior to the other, and then so nature moves on, right, through that conflict. Truth is truth for a culture, and truth evolves as a culture evolves. So yes, this is a relativistic view of what is true, but truth within a particular context. So when you're in a particular culture that has truths that everybody in that culture believes in, yes, those are true for the people in that culture, right? So it's not relative, it doesn't matter, right? It's true within that particular culture. But the thing to recognize is if you're in Rome, behave the way the Romans do, right? Be aware of your surroundings and behave appropriately from place to place. There's a Weltgeist. You might have even heard this expression for Hegel, right? Geist means ghost or spirit, right? So Geist, you have an individual Geist, right? Bist du von alle guten Geistern verlassen, right? Have you lost your mind, right? So you have a Geist, right? And you can lose it, right? Don't, right? But we also have spirit in the sense of team spirit, right? City has a kind of team spirit. Society has a spirit. The world at the moment has, in a sense, a Weltgeist, a world soul. There's another translation for that, right? What's the spirit of the times? A Zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the times. We don't dance like they did in the Roaring *20s right now, right? We don't dress that way. The Zeitgeist changed. I was watching a movie last night. It was fascinating. There was an article in the New York Times in the arts section about a particular actress who killed herself at 40. And overdose of habituates? What's
Barbiturates?
Barbiturates? Some kind of drug. Don't take it, whatever that is. But what? Who the heck is she? I'd never even heard of her. So I looked it up. Yep, there she is. on YouTube.
She'll know it, everybody, and she know it.
My
John
lord,
Gilbert. So
you
there
have
she
given
is.
me such strength, such courage. It must be a most wonderful thing
The
to be
short
an
hair?
archbishop.
Yes.
And
Got a
I
little
will
boy.
send all these silly folks away.
She was.
So that I
She
may speak to
graduated
those
from high school. Was going to go to college for something, but decided instead to get
You
into
allow me
movies.
to
So,
pass these.
and they needed a
I'm
young.
not sure. Is that Queen?
No, but she thinks she is.
Richard
Your Highness, not to jive at my wife.
Who the old grappling ground?
Is the Duc de la
Is that anything to do with Joan of Arc?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, Saint
Okay.
Joan of Arc.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's an older movie version.
Yeah,
of-
right.
Actually, my favorite is one of the silent films, because it has Eichhorn's music that you can listen to. Eichhorn. I don't know if it's called Joan of Arc. Maybe not. Did I misspell it? Oh, there it is. So this is the Passion. That's a different actress, right? It's not the same one. She's older. But I don't know what happened to Eichhorn's music. That's not her.
I was gonna say, it sounds very contemporary.
Yeah, I can't remember what his. I can't remember the name of the piece, but it's he. So it was a silent movie. So different people make music to play along with it, so that you're not bored to death watching a quiet movie. And so Eichhorn was my favorite. Voices? Eichhorn. How did they spell it?
Eichhorn's Voices of Light.
Voices of Light, that's it. Eichhorn. Voices of Light. Is that Einhorn, that's it. It's just absolutely gorgeous. Paternoster. Oh, this whole thing is just a fun. There's something in the way that music drops that little bit there, that just spine tingling effect. This whole thing was a squirrel. Sorry, mental illness. So, for Hegel, remember he was Lutheran, so Christian, Protestant, fairly conservative. In fact, one of the reasons he was brought to Berlin was to negotiate between kind of a radical, liberal religious treatment of Christianity and the conservative fundamentalist that wanted, that stopped. He came in and basically ameliorated between the two of them, and everybody was happy, at least for a while he was there. So he did a good job in calming everybody down and kind of being the middle way for that. But so God is the root and end of all. God is spirit and freedom. The world spirit, the Weltgeist, right, is active and dynamic development. So the Spirit of God participates in the world through culture, but by the way, we could certainly expand that as it would later and say through nature as well, not just through social nature, right? And development takes place in this dialectical mode, usually described as a particular situation, which we could call a thesis, right? And out of that thesis draws it's not necessarily an opposite, but an opposition. You know, just so even just sitting in the chair, you're tired to sit in the chair, but after you've been sitting there a while, you start to feel uncomfortable, right? So it's not necessarily the opposition of feeling comfortable, but things do not remain in a stasis. They keep changing, right? So how do we describe that change? Well, it's sort of this opposition occurs, right? And between that uncomfortable and comfortable, you maybe get up, maybe change your position or something, go get a cushion, go sit in another chair. Something else will happen and change the situation. So you go from a thesis opposed to an antithesis, which resolves itself in a new synthesis, which then is the new thesis that again draws an antithesis, creates that conflict, moves to a next synthesis, right? So it's just the logic approach of how this dialectical process is present in virtually everything, throughout nature, throughout society, throughout your sitting deciding, gee, what major should I have in, college, et cetera, right? You could view this system as present in virtually anything like that. The will, self-interest, and action of humans are the means by which spirit realizes its goals. And world historical heroes and peoples are the decisive forces of history. This is also the great man thesis. Remember, he's sitting there writing and looking out the window, and he sees Napoleon ride by on his white horse. And he sees Napoleon riding, he says, there goes the world soul on a horse. Right? Because Napoleon is that great man that's decisively changing society. The future is being directed by this one guy that's riding by on a horse, right? Incredibly powerful. So there's the great man in history that can cause this. Of course, we get into arguments. Was Napoleon significant that way? If Napoleon wasn't there, would someone else have been Napoleon? Was it the situation that created Napoleon? Or was it Napoleon himself as a specific individual that created this situation? It wouldn't have happened had it not been for Napoleon. You can see arguments over Lincoln, for example. There's books out there that argue Lincoln became the way he was because he was forced to glory. Right? There were literally situations that forced his hand. He couldn't help himself. He had to do these things. Right? On the other hand, you could argue, of course, that Lincoln is literally the reason for all these events. I mean, the war wouldn't have started had he not been elected. If it was his competitor, the South wouldn't have rebelled, etc. Right? So, spirit and history. The story of human progress is about the developing self-consciousness of the universe, God itself. Also associate this then with German idealism. The state is the end of history, the embodiment of reason. A lot of people argue that Hegel was just absolutely conservative, pro the German state, but that's clearly wrong. He was very, very much for Napoleon and the French Revolution. He was one of several that went out and planted a liberty tree. And they were so excited about the changes that were happening, they planted a liberty tree. By the way, the United States people in the United States planted a liberty tree. So that was kind of a in vogue among young men to plant a specific tree and call it the liberty tree, like an oak of some sort. The oak tree is even the metaphor that he uses quite a lot because when we're talking about the mechanistic model of the universe that we associate with Descartes and with Sir Isaac Newton It's kind of like that clock metaphor, if you remember in the movie, you know, where they're standing in that great big metal clock room, right, with the clock ticking. I showed you that.
Yeah.
Yes. So the clock's ticking away. It's like the whole universe is like this clock. But now, thanks to Hegel and our contemporary point of view, it's more of an organic growth kind of model, like a tree. So an acorn growing into a sprout, into a small tree, into a bigger tree, into a bigger tree, until it collapses in the storm, and now it's sawdust and stuff, right? You know, so the whole thing is all process, right? Continual dialectical change, right? And everything is interrelated with everything else. So the oak tree isn't just a tree by itself, it's also home to all the birds, to the bugs that eat it, to the nutrients in the ground that are exchanged by the tree and by the fungi and everything in the dirt and so on. So it's a whole ecosystem. You're an ecosystem. 50% of your body weight isn't you. It's all these little organisms that are basically symbiotically living in your ecosystem, right? You know, so you have bacteria, right? You have bacteria, you have mitochondria, you have all sorts of things. I don't even know what all they are. But from what I understand, roughly 50% of our body weight isn't us. Does that make sense? It's not like you want to get rid of them, though. What a great diet. No, you'd be dead because you need them, right? You couldn't digest your food without them, etc. All right. I don't think this actually goes to. No, I don't want Kierkegaard. I want Mill. Okay. So now we could go and explore lots of different directions because Hegel essentially sets our contemporary template. So what we're essentially looking at from Hegel on are responses to Hegel, kind of finessing the template, so to speak. Right? John Stuart Mill, 1806, 1873. I don't know why I say these notes are under construction. I'm not planning on doing anything with them. Should I fix them? What do I need to fix? I don't remember. Okay. John Stuart Mill. I even brought, gosh, I've been reading this. Should I read you some? Or would that put you to sleep? So what should I read about? It's really so interesting.
Utilitarianism.
Mill's account of his childhood and early education up to the age of 12 is a retrospective glance at the formative influences of his life. There are 3 important points that he stressed about this early phase. First, he tells us that from about the age of 12, I entered into another and more advanced stage in my course of instruction in which the main object was no longer the aids and appliances of thought, that is, information and the thoughts of others, but the thoughts themselves. That is, Mill thought that at the age of 12 he was able to engage in the self-conscious critique of ideas and not merely in their acquisition. That's at the age of 12. How come? Well, let's go back and look at the things that he's already been learning since. Okay. So, James Mill, his father, spent a considerable period of time almost every day in educating his own children. So, John Stuart Mill, named in honor of James Mill, his father's noble sponsor, right, was John Stuart. Right? So John Stuart Mill, as an example of his father's commitment to education, the largest part of the first chapter of Mill's autobiography focuses on what has become the most famous early childhood reading list of all time. Mill was taught Greek at the age of 3. At the age of 5, Mill accompanied George Bentham on a visit to Lady Spencer, the wife of the head of the Admiralty, whereupon Mill discoursed on the comparative merits of Marlborough and Wellington. The Duke of Marlborough was Winston Churchill's grandfather, right? And Wellington was the one that defeated Napoleon, right? Mill read Plato in Greek by the age of 7. He read the histories by Robertson, Hume, and Gibbon at the same time. Gibbon, that's the 3-volume Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, right? At the age of 8, he studied Latin. Newton's Principia Mathematica was mastered by the age of 11. The classics of logic by 12, and the rigors of higher mathematics, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and David Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation by 14. At the age of 15, Mill was introduced to the writings of Jeremy Bentham, and this was soon followed at age 16 by the philosophical works of Locke, Berkeley, Helvetius, and Condillac. Among the many authors Mill cites are Plutarch, Virgil, Ovid, Lucretius, Cicero, Homer, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, Thucydides, Tacitus, Juvenal, Polybius, Aristotle, Shakespeare, Milton, Spencer, and Dryden. Some indication of the extent and rigor of this regimen can be gathered. At this age, I was reading Tarzan books. And my parents were thrilled because I was reading Tarzan books, right? Okay, some indication of the extent and rigor of this regimen can be gathered from the following summary. In 1814, at the age of 8, Mill was reading Thucydides, Sophocles' Electra, Euripides' I don't even know how to say that, Finiciae, I don't know, Aristophanes' Plutus and the Clouds, and the Philippics of Demosthenes in Greek. In Latin, he was reading the Oration for Archias of Cicero, as well as the Antiveres. In mathematics, he was studying Euclid and Euler's algebra, as well as Bonnycastle's algebra and West geometry. In 1814, he also began reading Ferguson's Roman history, Mitford's Grecian history, and Livy in English. At the same age of 8, he was himself writing a history of the the age of 8, he's writing his own history of the United Provinces from the revolt from Spain in the reign of Philip II to the ascension of the Stadtholder William III to the throne of England, right? Age of 8.
It's pretty impressive.
I think I was learning how to spell at 8. He also wrote a history of Roman government to the Licinian laws. The latter were significant in Roman history for promoting democratic reforms, such as mandating that at least one consul had to be a plebeian. It makes you think, Mozart wasn't so great. The 1815 reading list included in Greek the Odyssey, Theocritus, 2 orations of, look how long it is, etc. So when it gets later and it says, okay, so he's now at the point where at 12, he's just thinking about his own thoughts instead of the thoughts of others. Whoa. And by the way, he also had to teach his siblings. Because the father, once he taught him, and he got to teach all the other kids. And he becomes part of the East India Company, following his father. That was like the job that he had that made the family money, etc. But they're also connected to Jeremy Bentham. And he's really just about as impressive. His father was a minister. And as I recall, I'm not trying to remember here. I'm pretty sure his father was a minister. His grandfather was a shoemaker, I think. I might be confusing him with John Stuart Mill's grandfather was a shoemaker. I think so. So I'm not sure if I remember Jeremy Bentham. But in any case, Jeremy Bentham's going to have the same kind of reading list and education when he's young. He does go to the university, though. Now, the interesting thing is, John Stuart Mill's father doesn't feel like the university is a good place for his kids because at the time the university really wasn't teaching them science and new things. And so this is the point where England is moving into the industrial age and science is becoming more important. If you go to Oxford and Cambridge, you have to sign the document swearing allegiance to the code of belief associated with the church. Right? And Jeremy Bentham is an atheist. He becomes an atheist. He doesn't agree with that, so he's not going to sign it. Actually, I think Jeremy Bentham did sign it, and it pissed the heck out of him that he did, because in retrospect he realizes he was not honest with himself in doing that. Right? John Stuart Mill, just like his father James, didn't sign that, and as a result that limited really the opportunities that they had, because they were admitting atheism right from the get-go, right? And yet they would go to church. As young children, they would go to church. So that's interesting too, right? How do you account for that? But Jeremy Bentham, he's very close to the family. In fact, at one point they're living in a house in the same square with Jeremy Bentham, and in fact he was paying half the rent on their house. Because at the time James Mill he was making like 150 pounds a year, and he couldn't afford all of their costs and everything. But by the time he ended up being like a secretary of the East India Company, he was making like 850 pounds a year, which was like plenty of money. Okay, so now he can not only pay for everything, but also pay his debts. And by the way, part of why James Mill had so many debts was because he had 9 children. He was mad at himself for doing that too. He thought, boy, that was really dumb. Shouldn't have so many children, because now you have to pay for them, etc. Right? Okay. So they're close with Jeremy Bentham. They're all involved in trying to change the political situation so that the poor people have a better chance. So they're liberals. They're creating the concept of liberals, essentially. And Jeremy Bentham argues that the main point of doing anything is for happiness. And so we should have a way of measuring happiness, and that's referred to as the hedonistic calculus. How on earth do you measure happiness? Imagine trying to develop oh, you're happier than this person. Oh, how do you do that? How do you figure? By the way, I heard a wonderful explanation of the secret of happiness. How to be happy. The secret of happiness. Low expectations. You don't want much. It's going to be pretty easy for you to be happy. Am I running out of time?
Much.
Yes?
No. Oh, you still got time.
There's actually a country in Asia, I think it's Asia, that bases their government off of how happy their people are.
Oh, yeah,
They
I've
have
seen,
like gross
they
domestic
think
happiness or
the way
something.
they measure it, they're supposed to be the happiest country in the world.
Yep.
But Denmark says that they're the happiest country in the world. You know what? I don't think Denmark is telling the truth. I don't think, how do you know how to measure it? There's actually lots of different ways of measuring happiness, and you could be happy right now and sad that you were happy right now because you were sitting right at the moment while you were so happy, and afterwards you're going to feel bad for having done that, right? Right. So there's different kinds of happiness, but somehow what he'd like to do is figure out how we can create a hedonistic calculus. He also is politically active in trying to get governmental reforms down to the poor. It's kind of interesting because if we tie this in to some of their contemporaries, of course we've got Charles Dickens. Everyone, I guess, is familiar with Charles Dickens, the some of his stories are famous, such as the Christmas Carol, right, with Scrooge, right, and the Oliver Twist, which you also end up with the musical Oliver. There's also a book called Hard Times. It says it's his 10th novel. Hard Times is a book where a main character named Mr. Gladgrind is kind of like the Scrooge of the novel. He's the one that runs the company and tries to make sure that they're making as much profit as possible. And the bad thing that happens to him that shows that this is all a bad way to live is that all of his children end up dying at the end. And by the way, this book arguably is targeted at Malthus. Malthus should be. Did I not type it right? Oh, I did. Sorry, Malthus. So Malthus was a minister, so Reverend Malthus, right? And his work, his arguments, argue this is like theory of evolution applied to population, right? And basically argues that when people have enough food, they reproduce at such a rate that within a short period of a generation or so, they end up with no longer too many people to feed. And so you end up with famine, plague, war, or some other natural means that will decrease the population back down again. And then they have enough food and resources to grow the population again. But then the calculations work out so that you always end up growing faster than the food supply, so that these natural Malthusian disasters occur relatively frequently. It's just part of nature. So when the Irish are, so a Malthusian catastrophe, right?
So he was a pessimist.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can see that ever since Adam Smith was a contemporary of David Hume, and he gives us the Wealth of Nations, the argument, that it's kind of the beginnings of economics, right? The science of economics, which is also referred to as the not the depressing science, but there's another name for it, melancholy science, or Kierkegaard's the melancholy Dane, but economics is also kind of melancholic because it's never going to be good, right? And so you get these Malthusian catastrophes, right? So growth. So you look at a chart, say for example, of how many McDonald's are there? Not very many. Whoa! Now we've got a lot, and then there's too many of them or something. Everybody running out of oil. The cupboards peak.
Right, that'll be a problem.
Yeah. Well, they can. But Charles Dickens is targeting Malthus apparently with his book Hard Times as a kind of a moral critique of that mindset. So you can imagine that Mill, Bentham, these are the individuals that are the intellectuals that are trying to fight against that kind of capitalistic hard-heartedness against the poor, right? And you can imagine all the Charles Dickens books are basically, insights into what miserable circumstances the poor have, and that we ought to learn from that literary experience and not want the poor to suffer like that. Like Scrooge. At the end of the book, we buy the turkey. We try to have a feast for the family. We give Bob Cratchit a raise, right? And all that sort of thing.